While Macron was giving speeches about European sovereignty and Sanchez was declaring that Europe would never bow to American economic pressure, Germany's new chancellor was already in Washington, already behind closed doors, already shaking hands. Friedrich Merz did not tell Paris. He did not call Rome. He did not consult Brussels. He flew to Washington, sat across from Donald Trump, and negotiated a private arrangement that gave German cars and German machinery a special exemption from the tariffs that every other European country was still paying in full. Not European cars, not European industry, German industry. While the continent was building a united front, its most powerful member was quietly walking out of the building through a back door with a golden ticket in his pocket and a smile on his face. The fury spreading across European capitals right now is not the ordinary friction of political disagreement between allies. It is the specific and devastating fury of people who trusted someone, built a strategy around that trust, and discovered that the trust had been sold for a tariff exemption, and the trade deal was not even the worst of what Merz agreed to in that room. What he gave away on nuclear deterrence, on NATO solidarity, on European strategic independence is something that no tariff reduction can ever compensate for. Europe is only now beginning to understand the full price of what was paid in Washington without its knowledge and without its consent. To understand the depth of what Friedrich Merz did in Washington, you have to understand what Germany is, what it represents inside the European project, and why the decisions made by whoever sits in the Chancellery in Berlin carry a weight that no other European government's decisions carry in quite the same way. Germany is not simply the largest economy in the European Union. It is the load-bearing pillar of the entire European political and economic architecture. The decisions made in Berlin about trade, about defense, about the direction of the European project, and the commitments Europe makes to its partners and to the world carry a multiplying effect that decisions made in any other European capital simply do not possess. When Germany speaks with Europe, Europe has a voice that the world takes seriously. When Germany breaks from Europe, the thing that breaks is not just a diplomatic relationship or a policy position. It is the foundational assumption upon which the entire European negotiating strategy has always rested. That assumption is unity. That assumption is the belief, maintained across decades of crises and disagreements and moments when national interest pulled in directions that diverged sharply from collective European interest, that when it truly mattered, when the stakes were genuinely high, the member states would hold together. Merz had positioned himself from the moment he took office as the leader who understood this. He had made the language of European solidarity central to his public identity in a way that was not merely rhetorical. He had spoken in specific and concrete terms about the importance of maintaining a united European front against Trump's tariff war. He had communicated to his counterparts in Paris, Rome, Madrid, and Warsaw that Germany would not break ranks, would not pursue bilateral arrangements that undermined the collective strategy, would not prioritize German national interest over European collective interest at the moment when collective interest most needed to be defended. Those assurances were the foundation on which von der Leyen's coordinated European trade response was being constructed. The strategy had genuine logic and genuine potential. The European Union represents a market of 450 million consumers with purchasing power that no American administration could afford to treat as disposable. If Europe spoke with one voice, if every member state maintained the unified position and refused to be picked off individually through bilateral arrangements, the collective weight of that unified position gave Europe leverage that individual national responses could never produce. Trump's tariff strategy had always depended on division. It depended on the calculation that national economic self-interest would eventually fracture European solidarity, that the member states with the most to lose from prolonged tariff warfare would eventually prioritize their own survival over the collective strategy, creating the openings that bilateral deal-making required. Merz had looked at that strategy from the inside and had concluded something that he never said publicly, but that his actions in Washington revealed with complete clarity. He had concluded that Europe's united front was not going to hold, and that Germany, with more to lose than any other European economy from extended tariff warfare, could not afford to go down with a solidarity project that was going to fracture regardless of what Berlin did. The German economy's exposure to American trade barriers was not a marginal concern that could be absorbed while the diplomatic process worked through its proper channels at its normal pace. German automotive manufacturers, the companies that employed hundreds of thousands of workers in communities across the industrial heartland of the country and that contributed disproportionately to the export revenues that funded the broader social compact of German economic life, were facing a mounting crisis with every week that the tariffs remained in place. The pressure on Merz from German industry was not the ordinary background noise of business lobbying that any chancellor manages as a routine part of governing. It was existential in its urgency and specific in its demand. Something had to be done. Not eventually, now. What Merz did in Washington went considerably further than a trade arrangement, though the trade arrangement alone would have been sufficient to detonate the crisis of European confidence that followed its revelation. The framework discussed in the private meeting with Trump addressed German car and machinery exports directly, carving out a special exemption from the 10% global tariff that had been applied to European goods, not an exemption negotiated through European institutions on behalf of the European automotive sector, an exemption negotiated bilaterally for German products specifically, leaving French cars and Italian cars and Spanish industrial goods and every other European export to continue paying the full rate while German competitors accessed the American market under preferential terms. The competitive distortion this created within the European single market was not a secondary consideration. It was an immediate and concrete economic wound inflicted on European partners by a European partner. Italian luxury car manufacturers, French industrial exporters, Spanish agricultural producers all found themselves facing a competitive disadvantage against German goods in the American market, not because German products were superior or more efficiently produced, but because Germany's chancellor had negotiated a private arrangement that purchased competitive advantage at the expense of the allies he had publicly committed to standing beside. The concessions Merz made in exchange for this arrangement extended well beyond the trade dimension in ways that European defense analysts and foreign policy experts have described as strategically catastrophic in their long-term implications. Germany committed to prioritizing the purchase of American liquefied natural gas over alternative suppliers, a commitment that directly contradicted the European energy independence agenda that Brussels had been constructing since the Russian invasion of Ukraine had exposed the continent's dangerous dependency on single-source energy supply. The logic of that European agenda had been to diversify supply, to reduce the leverage that any single external supplier could exercise over European energy policy, to build the kind of resilient distributed energy infrastructure that would prevent energy from being used as a geopolitical weapon against European interests. Germany's LNG commitment handed Washington precisely the kind of long-term leverage over German energy policy that the European independence agenda had been designed to prevent any external party from acquiring. The defense commitments were worse still. Germany agreed to increase purchases of American military equipment and to give American defense contractors preferred access in German military procurement processes. The significance of this commitment cannot be understood in isolation from the context in which it was made. Europe had been in the early stages of a serious and genuinely consequential effort to build its own defense industrial base, to reduce its dependency on American military procurement, and to create the kind of autonomous European defense capability that would allow the continent to make its own security decisions without requiring American approval or American participation. Germany's procurement commitments struck directly at the financial foundation of that effort. Defense industrial capacity is built through procurement decisions. When the largest defense procurement budget in Europe commits to preferencing American suppliers, the European defense industrial base that the continent's strategic autonomy agenda requires cannot develop the scale and capability it needs to be credible. Merz had not simply made a trade deal. He had made a series of interlocking commitments that individually were significant and collectively represented a fundamental reorientation of Germany's strategic posture away from European autonomy and toward American dependency across three of the most consequential domains of national and collective power that exist. Section 2. The details of what had happened in Washington did not arrive in European capitals through official channels. They did not arrive through a formal communication from the German Foreign Ministry to its counterparts in Paris, Rome, and Madrid. They did not arrive through a briefing from Berlin to Brussels explaining what Germany had discussed and what commitments had been made and why. They arrived the way the most damaging information always arrives in European politics, through leaks. Through diplomatic whispers passed between officials who had learned pieces of the picture through back channels and were assembling those pieces into a shape that grew more alarming with every additional fragment that confirmed what the earlier fragments had suggested. The reaction inside European institutions when that shape became clear was described by senior officials who experienced it as moving through distinct stages with unusual speed. The first stage was disbelief. Not the polite diplomatic disbelief of people who have been surprised by a development they should have anticipated, the genuine disbelief of people who had built an entire strategy around a specific assumption and were being told that the assumption had been false from the beginning, that the partner they had relied upon most heavily had been operating on a completely different set of priorities while publicly affirming the shared commitment that the collective strategy required. The second stage was anger, and the anger that spread through European institutions and European capitals in the hours after the details of the Washington meeting became impossible to deny was not the manageable kind of political anger that institutions are designed to absorb and process through established channels. It was the kind of anger that comes from betrayal specifically, from the particular violation of having trusted someone with something important and having that trust exploited in ways that caused direct and measurable damage to the people who had extended it. Von der Leyen's office had spent months constructing a coordinated European trade response to Trump's tariff war. The intellectual architecture of that response, the negotiating strategy, the sequencing of European countermeasures, the internal political management required to maintain the unity of 27 member states around a single position in the face of American pressure designed specifically to fracture that unity, had all been built on one foundational premise: that Germany would hold. That the largest economy in Europe, the country whose participation in the unified front gave it the weight and credibility that made Trump's team take it seriously as a negotiating adversary rather than an inconvenience to be managed, would not break away and pursue a bilateral arrangement that destroyed the collective leverage the strategy had been designed to create. That premise was gone, and with it went the strategy, the leverage, and the credibility of every European leader who had been publicly declaring that Europe would not bow to American economic pressure at the precise moment when Germany was privately doing exactly that. The embarrassment was total, and it was public. Macron had given a major speech about European sovereignty just days before the Washington details emerged. Sanchez had made a declaration about European economic independence that had been covered approvingly across European media as evidence that the continent was finding its collective backbone in the face of Trump's pressure. Those speeches now looked not like leadership but like ignorance, like leaders who had been speaking about unity while their most important partner was already in a private room in Washington dismantling the unity they were describing. The word that circulated in Madrid was backstabbing. In Rome, Meloni's private characterization of what Germany had done was reportedly considerably more direct than anything she was prepared to say on camera. In Paris, the response was expressed in the particular register of cold-controlled fury that French diplomacy deploys when it wants to communicate maximum displeasure while maintaining the surface form of institutional correctness. Macron did not give an angry press conference. He did not issue statements full of the kind of dramatic language that would allow Berlin to frame the French response as emotional overreaction. Instead, the French government began making a series of deliberate and carefully calibrated moves whose cumulative message was unmistakable to anyone with sufficient knowledge of how European diplomatic signaling actually works. French diplomatic contacts with Berlin were reduced to their minimum functional level, the precise minimum required to maintain the appearance of normal bilateral relations without actually conducting the substantive engagement that normal bilateral relations involve. French officials began systematically briefing European journalists with detailed and specific accounts of how Merz had bypassed EU institutions, undermined the common trade strategy, and made commitments that affected every European country without consulting a single European partner. And France began the most significant move of all, reaching out to Italy, to Spain, to Belgium, to the Netherlands, and to a number of smaller EU member states with a proposal that was not framed in the language of punishing Germany, but that was understood by everyone involved as exactly that. The proposal was the formation of what European political insiders had begun calling the counterbloc, a new alignment within the European Union's institutional architecture specifically designed to ensure that no single member state could repeat what Germany had just done, that no country, regardless of its economic size or its institutional influence, could walk into Washington or Beijing or Moscow and make commitments on behalf of the European project without authorization, without consultation, and without accountability to the partners whose interests those commitments affected. France and Italy were the natural core of this emerging alliance. Their economic complementarity, Their shared exposure to the competitive damage caused by the German exemption, and their shared fury at the method by which that exemption had been obtained, gave them the common ground that